Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have episode 25, I think, of recent reads. I've got a lot of books to talk about, even though it felt like I didn't read that much this week. I'll explain why in just a second. But to start off, I'm going to talk about a book that I DNF'd right at the end of last week, I think. Didn't include it in that recent reads. And that is the last of the Sandra Day O'Connor books that I had on my clearing off my oldest TBR list. I was desperately hoping that this was finally more memoir-like, but then I looked at the table of contents, and in the table of contents, you've got things like, oh, hold on, there's a preface. I enjoyed the preface the most. You've got things like a bit of history, people who have helped shape the court, women and the law, the legal profession and the courts, the rule of law in the 21st century. It's not memoir. It's more history. Again. I'm like, you've already written this book. Why are you doing it again? I got a few pages in and realized what it was about and went, nope, not reading that. So, really early DNF. I don't really count it as getting anything read. I have two different sections. So, physically, I didn't read a lot, and I had some pretty, well, one's chunky and one was just dense. So I had a nonfiction and then I had this one. But I'll talk about those in just a moment. Audiobook wise, because I had a really long drive down to the beach. I mean, I wasn't driving, but you know, traffic, etc. 4.5 hour trip took 7 hours. That's a lot of audiobook time. And then throughout the week, I listened to some audiobooks, some shorter audiobooks, and then I had the trip back. So I got, see, here's 4 books, but there's also one that I had to turn into the library, but I had via audiobook. So I finished 5 audiobooks this week. Okay, so I'm going to start with the audiobooks, and the first of those is the first audiobook that I finished and the one that I don't have physically. It's an SCASL book, and it's one for the young adult list that's actually going to be pretty high, and that is Lines of Courage. Now, I was a little bit nervous at first because it was World War themed, but then I saw that it was World War I themed, and I'm much more willing to give World War I stories a chance than World War II, because World War II just seems way overdone. But World War I, not so much. I loved this book. The way that the author told this story is she had basically 5 main characters and an interconnected story. You had, see, I'm not going to remember their names, but the first one was a young Austro-Hungarian boy who was with his father in, I can't remember the name of the city, where Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and he actually witnessed the assassination. Then you have a British girl whose father died in the fighting and whose mother is a nurse, and they end up on an ambulance train. And these trains would go to these sites. They'd pick up the men and take them back to actual hospitals. Then you had a French girl whose father was a high-ranking official, served the governor in a town that was taken over by the Germans, and so he was put into a prison camp. They basically had to flee for their lives. You also had a Russian soldier who he signed up way too early, so he was very young. And then you also had, I think it was a cousin or a friend of the first boy who was a German girl. And they all have connections. And it's not like it's multi-POV within the individual stories. Each chunk of the book shifts through those perspectives in that order. And the German girl at the end, I think her name's Elsa, she's the only one that you'd actually seen before by the time that you get to her perspective. You first meet her at the very beginning of the book in interactions with the Austro-Hungarian and Jewish, actually, boy. The way that the story is told, because you have all of the major players there. On the Ally side, you have the British, you have the French, you have the Russian. On the they weren't were they called the Axis in World War One? I'm failing as a historian. Anyway, on the other side, you have Austro-Hungarian and German. You don't have any Ottoman, but that would be really difficult to tie into this story. And so there's a little bit of where you have to suspend disbelief on the connections of these stories, but the author does it in such a way that it's very believable, very understandable. It tells the story because World War I is such a complex story. Unlike in World War II, where there feels like there's a big bad and there's an obvious side for things, World War I was a mess. It was just this buildup of basically greedy world powers who got all tangled up and then ended up in war, and now we have to figure out what to do here. And these kids are dealing with that and the interactions because just like it's arbitrarily that people fall on one side or the other. And the author just did a fantastic job weaving that all together. I really enjoyed that one. So next, we have Ithaca, which is my second to last aardvark book. I have only one more of those. I've realized that Greek myth retellings, when they're set in the mythological setting, aren't really necessarily my vibe. But this one approached it differently than Electra, even though there were some similar overlap characters. Like Electra herself appears in this one. Clytemnestra appears in this one. Cassandra is referenced. This is set on the island of Ithaca, which is the home, the kingdom of Odysseus. Odysseus is not back. This is towards the end of his 10-year odyssey when he is being kept captive by Calypso on her island. And it took a little while for me to realize that this book is narrated by Hera. That sort of a perspective meant that the story was told in a very different way. It felt like this book was still told in a Greek myth style, and you never really ended up connecting with any of the people. You could say that Penelope was a main character because Hera focuses on her a lot. Hera, one of her things that she's known as being the goddess of is of women and of marriage. And so, of course, she's going to focus on Penelope more. And in this book, it seems pretty clear that she's actually focused on what she calls her three Greek queens: Penelope, Clytemnestra, and Helen. And Penelope is the one that gets the most favorable take in this book, obviously. Helen doesn't really appear at all. The way that things are told in this is it's very different. It's very separated from the narrative because Hera herself, obviously, as a goddess, is separated from the narrative. She's kind of forbidden from interacting with the people. It's not like she can't do it, but she doesn't want to be flat out told by her husband, don't get involved, because women shouldn't be involved. And that's a big deal. Athena is also present, and so is Artemis. Athena more so than Artemis, and it's really interesting, the characterization of both of those two stepdaughters of Hera. And obviously Hera was not pleased with her husband's philandering, as to be expected. I appreciated this book and the way that it was told, but I don't necessarily know that this is something that I love. So I think this was well done. I just still think that Greek myth retellings are not necessarily my favorite. The next audiobook that I got to helped me finish off a series. Now, I don't know if more are going to be published in this, but I consider this finishing off a series, and that is Kiki Kalira Conquers a Curse. And I love the voice that Sangumandana gives to Kiki and the other characters in this world. I thought she did a really good job in coming back to it. So the setup for this, at least the first book, I won't tell you details of this particular book, but the setup of this, so Kiki deals with severe anxiety And the way that she deals with it is by drawing. And she creates this world based on Indian mythology in her sketchbook. And a real Asura gets a hold of it and makes it real. And she ends up going into that world and having to save her kingdom and all these people and events and places that she made up that have now become real. And that's the course of the first book. Did it need a sequel? No, it was wrapped up pretty well with the possibility of, say, returning to the world. And I was really excited when I saw that there was a sequel so that we could return to the world. The problem for me with this, even though a lot of the stuff is really well done, and I love the fact that her mom comes in and plays a role in this, like she actually tells her mom what's going on, and she's a present and supportive figure here, and it's normalizing therapy, and like her anxiety hasn't gone away, but she's learned techniques to help with that she uses throughout this. I think the problem was the conflict, her motivation in the first book was really crucial because it felt like it was so much a part of her. This, and it's something that she talks about, it's like she feels like her world is growing and moving away from her and she doesn't know what to deal with that. And so the things that she's dealing with in this book, they don't seem as motivating, as connected to her. And there's a lot going on involved in the curse that she's breaking in the title. And it just felt a little bit too much. So I prefer the first book to this, but I definitely really enjoyed this book. Now the third one is one that I legit finished a series, and that is Tristan Strong Keeps Punching. So one of the things that brought the second book in the series down a little bit for me was the fact that you already knew the identity of the big bad. And that was one of the reveals that really just gripped me in the first book and made the first book so amazing. In this book, I think it almost returned to the level of the first book. Almost. I won't go too much into the plot of this particular book, but the basis for this is Tristan is about 12 years old, and at the start of the first book, he is going down to visit his family somewhere in the South. I don't remember exactly where. His parents have sent him there as a way to get him out of Chicago, as a way to help him in his grief, because towards the end of the school year, he was in a tragic school bus accident that killed his best friend. And he feels guilty for not going back and saving his friend. And his friend gives him this book that turned out to be a little bit magical. And then you get the introduction of one of my favorite characters, Gum Baby, because she comes into his house and tries to steal it and take it back. Of course, Tristan, who's still really grieving his best friend, this is the last thing he has of his best friend, he doesn't want to let that go. And so he chases her. And when he does, though, he goes through this section of bluebottle trees, which is part of African American mythology where the haints, the bad spirits, were captured and put into these blue bottles, and that kept them there and kept places safe. Well, while he's chasing Gum Baby, he breaks one of those blue bottles and he sort of punches a hole into the sky and ends up in Alki, which is a mythological world that combines African American folklore like Brer Rabbit and etc. and West African mythology. You've got Anansi, you've got Ayame, you've got so many that I can't remember off the top of my head. And so it builds from there. In this particular book, one of the things that Tristan has been dealing with for a long time is his anger that's built up over the guilt of not saving his friend. And he's dealt with it in various ways in the first two books. And it becomes a central driving issue in this book. And the way that the adults, I'll say, the mythological figures, help him deal with this, I'm like, it seems logical for him to be feeling this way, to want to make these decisions to keep the big bad that was revealed at the end of book one from doing even more bad things in the real world now. Some of that just felt a little weird, their response to him, because of that anger. Now he does end up learning how to deal with that anger and learning a lot about himself and the ways that that interacts. And he also learns a lot about the history, how the mythology from West Africa came over to the United States and how that interacted with different slave interpretations of that and how they dealt with it and how they were treated in the South. There was a real powerful mixture of that in this book. And I thought that Kwame Mbalia did a fantastic job with that in this book. I still think that the first book is number one in my mind, but this is a phenomenal trilogy. The last audiobook that I finished completely last week is my book of the month book, and that is Hester. So the basis for this is that it's sort of a retelling of the Scarlet Letter, but almost as if this might be the inspiration for the Scarlet Letter, because it's not known what Nathaniel Hawthorne's inspiration for the Scarlet Letter was. And Nathaniel Hawthorne is basically the love interest in this story. And the main character, her name is not Hester, her name is Isabel. That did throw me off at points because the main character is in first person, and so I wasn't remembering that her name was Isabel, not Hester, but Hester is the main character of the Scarlet Letter. And one of the things that Isabel is dealing with, and women in her family have dealt with for years, is, I forget the name for it, but it's where they see different things as colors, where some of the senses mix together. And throughout history, people like that. If they said, oh, I see an A is always red or scarlet, it lent the idea of you must be a witch. She ends up dealing with that as a young child, and her mom tells her to keep it quiet. Her mom dies very early on, and her life doesn't go exactly as she wanted, but she ends up marrying a much older man that she thinks will help. And that man he's an apothecary, and he ends up getting addicted to opium, and they end up in the poorhouse, and through that they end up having to travel to the New World to make their life. And various things happen through that, and there's a lot of plot beats that are vaguely similar to the Scarlet Letter, but not exactly similar. And I thought that Laurie Albanese did a really good job with posing a what if. What if this could have potentially been the inspiration for the Scarlet Letter? What if Nathaniel Hawthorne saw himself in the main character pastor figure in the Scarlet Letter, whose name I can't remember? And I think she did a really good job in that, and in also making Isabel a very strong character who learns how to deal with things on her own and make her own life and her own way in the world. It does bring in a little bit of aspects of American slavery, because this was set in the early 1800s, and this is something that Isabel was not really accustomed to. And there is another character named Mercy who is black and who is looked down upon by basically everybody in this in Salem, because it's set in Salem, Massachusetts, which is a very real thing. I think this was an enjoyable, immersive Gothic read. Is it perfect? No. There are nitpicky things that I could come up with at various points, but she did a good enough job that I actually Googled to see if there was any similarity with real life events. There's not really. This is definitely taking artistic license on the life of Nathaniel Hawthorne and the events that may have inspired the Scarlet Letter. And I have to mention that the audiobook that I am currently listening to, I'm only about 20% of the way through, is an audiobook that when I went to look up digital availability for this book, because I've been on the wait list for a while, not necessarily because I want to read this book, but because I know for sure it's going to be on the Goodreads list, and it's probably going to win the Goodreads award for fantasy. But when I looked, there was no wait for the audiobook, and I thought, well, this is odd. So I checked it out. There are now like 23 people behind me. I don't know, maybe they just got the audiobook in at my library and I happened to look for it at the right time. That book is Fourth Wing. I'm only 20 or so percent into the book and I don't get it. I'll talk more about it next week once I have finished it. I don't see anything really bad or awful about it thus far, but I don't understand the hype for this book. I don't get it. And I'll leave it there. Now, that brings me to the 2 physical books that I read this week. They took up most of my physical reading time throughout the week at the beach, and I didn't do a lot of physical reading. And the first of those is one of my 23 and 23 books, and one of the nonfictions that I have for the month, and that is Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education, and the Assault on American Democracy. I had a lot of thoughts about this book. So what I have started to do in order to make my reviews a little bit better, I'm using one of the notebooks that I got in a Fairy Loot box. I think one of my last Fairy Loot boxes. And so you can see I've started taking notes, and right there is where I started taking notes on Schoolhouse Burning, which was on the first page. I have a whole other page of notes, and I finished the notes there. So I had a lot of notes about this particular book. And I, in recent months and years, have pulled back on reading as much about education as I have in the past. It's just not something that's really compelling, but I was intrigued enough by this particular book. So Derek Black is a man who is not necessarily a first-generation college grad, but he's one of a few. And he was raised in rural Tennessee as a white man and ended up getting a degree in, it was mixed with several things, but one of those things was African American studies, because he had an interaction with one of the professors in that department, and that professor left a really strong impression on him, and he went on to get a law degree, and he studied at Howard University and apparently taught at Howard University, which is an HBCU, historically black college and university in Atlanta. And he is very strong in the civil rights arena. And he currently teaches law at the University of South Carolina. So in this book, I didn't know starting out whether it was going to be all about more current events, or if it was going to be an overview of how public education has interacted with different aspects of democracy in the United States. It turned out to be a kind of a mix of both. So in the preface, he gives his background and his reason for wanting to write this book and getting into this arena. And then the first chapter sets up the scenario for a lot of the things that are going on now. Then in the 2nd through 9th chapters, I think it is, he talks about the history of public education in the United States and how it has interacted with different aspects of democracy in the United States. And then he finishes up with 2 chapters, one where he says it's through the eye of history, and it's almost like a recap on what's happening now and sort of tying that back to what he's talked about earlier in the book. And the last chapter are his final thoughts, basically his ideas for what should happen next. One of the things that I found a little bit frustrating in those bookend chapters about the current day aspects is, especially in the first chapter before I'd gotten into the bulk of the book, was that he was making a lot of statements, but he wasn't necessarily putting footnotes and referencing back to where he got that evidence. Now, do I personally know that that evidence is out there because I've seen it? Yes, but he wasn't giving that evidence in the chapter, which, like, if you want to make a really strong argument, please make sure that you are backing it up with your receipts. Then we get into the history portion, and he doesn't give a detailed overview of public education. He does not go through the entire scope of it, and I've studied that a lot. But he hits at very certain points in the history of public education in the United States. That complaint that I had about no receipts, no evidence, he like funnels so much evidence, primary sources galore throughout the bulk of the book. And I'm like, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about, and he's making really solid points throughout this book. Then we get to the other bookend, and he does it again, where he is talking about the more modern situation, and he doesn't make the sort of connections that I know are there, that I know that he's thinking about, but he doesn't really make those connections and tie it with evidence. So that was just a little bit lacking for me, even though I 100% agree with what he's saying in this book. I will definitely be keeping this book. I have loaned it out to my mom. She has started reading it. That's her bookmark. I wish I could give her an audiobook version, but there doesn't seem to be an audiobook version of it. I think that this is a really good starting spot for understanding the crucial and vital nature of public education in the United States. And I just wish that a few things had been executed a little bit better. Now, I haven't run most of these books through Compile because I was on vacation. This book will probably end up at a 4.5 stars. It might end up at a very high 4 stars, but I think it's going to squeak out a 4.5 stars. The big behemoth of a book, and it's very appropriate that I'm wearing this book, because I like big books and I cannot lie, because I'm reading what I think was the biggest book on my 23 and 23 list, and that is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I knew not much before getting into this book, except for the fact that it's set like in the Victorian era, and it stars 2 magicians. Oh, I think I knew that it had footnotes, but I didn't know the extent to which the footnotes were used in this. So I started reading, and I found myself absolutely in love with the style. This book, written in the early 2000s, feels like it was written in that time period. It reads like a Victorian novel. And I love how Susanna Clarke put in the footnotes where it looked like it was like actually citing these different books that were these different magical books, and as if they really existed. The way that she did the footnotes was phenomenal. And it's almost exactly like footnotes that you would see in Victorian novels. The way that they did it, even including when they name different places and have just the first letter and then the dash. I never understood why they did that. But it completely embodies that. And I found myself strangely fascinated with this book, even though you don't go in depth on the characters. There are so many different things going on. You never really learn the identity of one of the pivotal characters. You don't get enough time with other characters, and you'll get time with those characters up until a certain point, and then it will switch to something completely random, and you're like, wait, why did you go there? And then it'll come in later why Susanna Clarke went there. This is just dry, but I couldn't look away. It gets weird in the last bit, and there was a lot of it that I didn't understand. So some of it read like Dickens. Some of it read like Austen. This latter part read like Hawthorne. And the really weird Hawthorne, like the, not Scarlet Letter, but some of the other, like Poe. Also some of the weirdness of Poe towards the end of it. But it's like Susanna Clarke took British and American authors of that time period, mashed them together, and this is the book. It's a masterpiece. I don't know how she completely embodied the time period and everything that's going on. And you get to the end and you go, what? All that just happened. And I couldn't look away. There's a blurb on the back of this from some publication that says, what kind of magic can make an 800-page novel seem too short? Whatever it is, Susanna Clarke is possessed by it. I 100% agree with that. Even though it took forever to read, I just kept getting sucked into this book. Am I going to try to tell you what it's about? Basically, it's about the restoration of magic to England. Yeah. And there's so much more. Is this the book for everybody? No. But this scratched an itch that I was just sort of developing for a classic novel. And I started reading this and I went, oh, I'm getting this, even though this is a book published in the mid-2000s. So I'll take that. So there you go. Those are the 6 books that I read completely this week, 1 DNF, and 1 other book started. We shall see what this next week holds in store. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.